worked at the Voss and Kendrick building for 2 years and 3 months. I say that with precision because I checked my employment records before writing this, and the dates didn't match what I remembered. I thought it had been closer to 3 years. That discrepancy bothers me more than it should. The building was on Harker Avenue, downtown, 14 floors of poured concrete and tinted glass built sometime in the early 80s. Not remarkable. Not ugly. The kind of building you'd walk past 1,000 times and never form an opinion about. I was hired as a facilities coordinator, which is a generous title for what amounted to managing maintenance requests, tracking vendor contracts, and making sure the HVAC system didn't kill anyone during August. My office was on the 3rd floor, tucked between a supply closet and a conference room that smelled permanently of burnt coffee. The job was fine. I want to be clear about that. It was a normal job in a normal building with normal people. I ate lunch at my desk most days. Usually a sandwich from the deli on the corner, the one with the green awning that's since closed. I took the stairs because the elevator on the east side made a sound I didn't like, a kind of low vibration you could feel in your back teeth. Nothing sinister about that. Old buildings have old elevators. I'm mentioning it only because it's the kind of detail that sticks. I started in March. The first several months were uneventful in the way that new jobs always are, overwhelming and tedious at the same time. I was learning the systems, the filing conventions, the unspoken rules of the office. Don't microwave fish. Don't use the 4th floor bathroom if you can help it. Park in the east lot if you're staying past 6, because the west lot gate jams. Small things. The social architecture of a workplace. My supervisor was a woman named Diane Oleski. She'd been with the building management company for 11 years and had the specific kind of patience that comes from having explained the same thing to dozens of people who eventually quit. She trained me thoroughly. Fire evacuation routes, shelter-in-place protocol for severe weather, active threat procedures, the standard run-hide-fight framework, lockdown communication chains. She walked me through every page of the Emergency Procedures Manual, a 3-ring binder with tabbed sections, and a laminated quick reference card in the front pocket. I read that manual cover to cover during my first week. I'm that kind of person. I like knowing how things are supposed to work. The manual was detailed and clear, color-coded floor plans, numbered steps, phone trees, assembly points. Everything you'd expect from a professionally managed commercial building. What I didn't expect was what happened about 4 months in. It was a Thursday in July. I was on the 6th floor replacing a ceiling tile that had water damage. Nothing urgent, just cosmetic. The floor was mostly occupied by an accounting firm, Bellwether Associates, and at that hour, mid-afternoon, the office was quiet. Most of their staff were in a training session down the hall. I was standing on a stepladder when I heard the tone. It wasn't the fire alarm. I knew the fire alarm. 3 short pulses, pause, repeat. It wasn't the severe weather alert either, which was a continuous warble. This was a single sustained tone. Low. Not loud exactly, but present. It seemed to come from the ceiling speakers, the same ones used for the standard PA system. But the quality was different, flatter, like the sound hadn't been designed to get your attention so much as to fill the space. It lasted maybe 6 seconds, then stopped. I stood there on the ladder for a moment, waiting for it to repeat or for a voice to follow. Some announcement, some explanation. Nothing came. The hallway stayed quiet. I finished replacing the tile and went back downstairs. I mentioned it to Diane the next morning. "Did something trigger on the 6th floor yesterday?" I heard a tone I didn't recognize. She looked at me over her coffee. Not startled, not confused, just holding still for a moment longer than felt natural. "Probably a system test," she said. "The PA gets checked quarterly." It didn't sound like the standard tones. Older speakers distort sometimes. I wouldn't worry about it. That was the end of the conversation. And she was probably right. Old speakers, old wiring, old building. Things distort. I filed it away and forgot about it. Or I would have, except that 2 weeks later I was in the stairwell between floors 9 and 10, and I passed Gerald Maines coming down. Gerald was one of the security guards, had been with the building for something like 15 years. Older guy, quiet, the kind of person who'd nod at you every morning for a year before he'd start a conversation. I liked him. He didn't perform friendliness the way some people do. We stopped on the landing. He was carrying a clipboard, which was unusual. Gerald usually just had his radio and his keys. "You hear that tone a couple weeks back?" I asked, casually. I don't know why I brought it up. Maybe because it had settled into the part of my brain where unresolved small things live. Gerald looked at me, and there was something in that look. Not fear. Not exactly. Recognition, maybe. Like I'd said a word in a language he didn't expect me to speak. "Which floor were you on?" he asked. "6th. He nodded slowly. "Tile replacement." "Yeah." "Heard it, did you?" "Yeah." Diane said it was a system test. Gerald didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he shifted the clipboard to his other hand and said, "Some procedures aren't in the binder." I waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. He just nodded once, politely, conclusively, and continued down the stairs. I want to be honest about my reaction, because I think it matters. I didn't feel afraid. I felt annoyed. It sounded like the kind of vague, self-important thing that long-term employees sometimes say to make themselves feel essential. Every workplace has its unofficial lore, its whispered knowledge that amounts to nothing. I assumed Gerald was just being Gerald. But the phrase stayed with me. Some procedures aren't in the binder, and over the next few weeks, I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. The first thing I noticed was the signs. Not all of them. Most of the signage in the building was standard. Exit routes, fire extinguisher locations, AED stations, the usual. But on certain floors, in certain stairwells, there were small adhesive placards I'd never really looked at. They were the same institutional beige as the walls, about 2 inches by 3 inches, mounted at eye level. No text, just a symbol. A small circle with a horizontal line through the center. Like a simplified no-entry sign, but without the red. Just black on beige. I checked the emergency procedures manual. No mention of that symbol anywhere. I checked the building's original architectural drawings, which we kept in a filing cabinet in the basement office. No mention. I checked the signage vendor contract from 2014. The placards weren't on the order list. I started mapping them. There were 14 that I could find, spread across floors 3 through 12. They weren't at regular intervals. They weren't near exits or mechanical rooms or any location that had an obvious operational purpose. Some were in hallways. One was inside a supply closet on the 8th floor. One was on the wall of a bathroom stall on the 5th floor, which I found particularly strange. Not the kind of place you'd mount official signage of any kind. I brought this to Diane. I showed her my list. "Those are old," she said, probably from a previous management company. Nobody's gotten around to removing them. "They're clean," I said. "No yellowing. The adhesive is still firm." I wouldn't read too much into it. She said it pleasantly, the way she said most things. But she didn't look at my list. She didn't take the paper from my hand. And when I left her office, I saw her pick up her phone. I want to pause here and say something about what it feels like to work in a building every day and begin to suspect that the building has a dimension you can't see. It's not dramatic. It's not like the movies. It's more like discovering that a word you've been using your whole life has a second meaning you never knew about. The word hasn't changed. Your sentence hasn't changed. But the meaning shifts under your feet, just slightly, and you can't unshift it. I kept working. I kept doing my job. But I started noticing the way certain long-term employees moved through the building. Not all of them. Most people were exactly what they appeared to be, office workers navigating their routines. But a handful, maybe 5 or 6 that I could identify, had a quality to their awareness that was different. They knew where the placards were. I became almost certain of this. Not because they looked at them, but because they didn't. They navigated around those spots with a kind of peripheral precision, the way you step over a crack in a sidewalk you've walked 1,000 times. Unconscious. Practiced. Gerald was one. Diane was one. There was a woman on the 7th floor named Priya something. I never learned her last name. Who worked for one of the law firms. She'd been in the building at least 8 years. And there was a maintenance tech named Carl who did the elevator inspections. Quiet guy. Kept to himself. He'd been with the building since before I was born. I tried asking Carl about the placards once while he was servicing the freight elevator in the basement. Those symbols on the walls, I said. The circle with the line. Do you know what they're for? Carl was crouched inside the elevator shaft, adjusting something I couldn't see. He didn't stop working. Ask your supervisor, he said. I did. Then you have your answer. She said they were old, but they're not old. Carl stood up slowly. He was a big man, and in the confined space of the elevator pit, he seemed to fill it entirely. He looked at me without expression. Some things in this building are on a need-to-know basis, he said. And you're new. That was all. He went back to work. I went back upstairs. I should mention the basement. The Voss and Kendrick building had 2 sublevels. Sublevel 1 was standard parking, mechanical rooms, the main electrical panel, water heaters, the usual. Sublevel 2 was storage, mostly. Old furniture, archived files from tenants who'd moved out years ago, seasonal decorations. The lighting down there was fluorescent and inconsistent. Half the tubes had that gray tint that means they're dying but not dead. The air smelled like concrete dust and something faintly chemical. Not unpleasant. Just present. I went to Sublevel 2 regularly. It was part of my job. But there was a section of it I'd never been given a key for. At the far end of the east corridor, past the last row of storage cages, there was a fire door, heavy, steel, painted the same gray as everything else. It had a keycard reader mounted beside it, which was unusual. Most of the basement doors used physical keys. This one required a card I didn't have. I asked Diane about it during my 2nd month. Mechanical, she said. Old boiler access. Nothing down there you need. I checked the building plans. The area behind that door was marked as utility, restricted. No further detail. No room numbers. No square footage. Here's what made me think about it again. Months later, after the tone and the placards and the conversations with Gerald and Carl. One evening in October, I was staying late to finish a vendor report. The building was mostly empty. A few people on the upper floors, security at the front desk. It was maybe 8:30. I went down to Sublevel 2 to grab a box of old maintenance logs I needed for a compliance audit. The fluorescents were doing their usual flickering. My footsteps echoed. I found the box, pulled it off the shelf, and started back toward the elevator. That's when I noticed the fire door was open. Not wide open. Ajar. Maybe 4 inches. The magnetic lock was disengaged. I could see the small green LED on the card reader, which I'd only ever seen red before. I stood there for a long time. I'm not sure how long. The hallway beyond the door was dark, but not completely. There was a faint light source somewhere deeper in. A pale bluish glow that could have been emergency lighting, or could have been something else. The air coming through the gap was different, cooler, and it had a smell I couldn't place. Not chemical, not organic. Something between ozone and cold stone. Clean but wrong. In the way that a room that's been sealed for a long time smells clean because nothing living has been in it. I did not go through the door. I want to be clear about that. I'm not the kind of person who walks into dark basements and empty buildings at night. I turned around, went upstairs, and told the security guard, not Gerald, a younger guy named Marcus, that the Sublevel 2 fire door was open. Marcus radioed someone. I didn't hear the response. He told me it would be handled and thanked me for reporting it. The next morning, the door was closed. Red lead. I checked the access log for the card reader. My job gave me access to the building's security system, at least the standard dashboard. The Sublevel 2 fire door didn't appear in the log. Not as opened, not as closed, not as existing. There was no entry for that card reader at all. That's when I stopped being annoyed and started being something else. I don't have a good word for it. Not scared. Aware. Uncomfortably aware. Like I'd been looking at a picture my whole life and someone had pointed out a figure in the background I'd never noticed, and now I couldn't stop seeing it. November came. The days got shorter. The building felt different in winter. The heating system worked hard, and the air became dry and close. The windows on the upper floors would fog at the edges. The stairwells were colder. People moved differently. Faster, heads down. On November 14th at 2:47 in the afternoon, I heard the tone again. I was on the 3rd floor, in my own office. The tone came through the ceiling speaker above my desk. The same flat, sustained note. 6 seconds, then silence. This time, I watched. I went to my doorway and looked down the hall. Most people continued what they were doing. A few looked up briefly, the way you'd glance at a flickering light, then look back down. Normal reactions to an unexplained but non-threatening sound. But Diane stepped out of her office. She stood in the hallway, very still, for about 10 seconds. Then she walked, not toward the stairs, not toward the elevator, but to the supply closet at the end of the hall, the one with the placard. She opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. She was in there for 4 minutes. I timed it. When she came out, she looked exactly the same. She went back to her office and sat down. I didn't ask her about it. I don't know why. Something about the way she'd moved, purposeful, rehearsed, made me feel that asking would cross a line I couldn't uncross. That sounds dramatic, and I don't mean it to be. It was more practical than that. I had a sense, not a certainty, but a sense, that if I asked, something about my position in the building would change, and I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I started keeping a log. I noted every time I heard the tone. It wasn't regular. Sometimes weeks would pass. Sometimes it happened twice in 3 days. It was always the same. One sustained note, 6 seconds, no announcement. I noted who reacted and how. Most people ignored it. The long-termers, Gerald, Diane, Priya, Carl, a few others I was less sure about, would pause. Sometimes one of them would move to a specific location. Not always the same location, but always a location with a placard. I mapped the pattern, or I tried to. The placards were positioned on specific floors in specific spots, and the people who responded to the tone seemed to rotate between them, like stations, like positions in a formation I couldn't see the shape of. I started to think of it as a drill, an emergency drill for a procedure that wasn't in any manual. That was the least frightening explanation I could construct, and I held on to it. In December, something changed. I was in the parking garage, sub-level 1, walking to my car after a long day. It was dark outside, almost 7. The garage was mostly empty. My footsteps bounced off the concrete. I was fishing for my keys when I heard voices. They were coming from the mechanical room at the east end of the garage. The door was closed, but voices carry in parking garages. I couldn't make out words, but I could hear the rhythm. 3, maybe 4 people speaking in low tones. Not arguing, something more structured. Like a meeting or a briefing. I recognized Diane's voice. And Gerald's. The others I couldn't place. I stood by my car and listened. I'm not proud of that. Eavesdropping on your supervisor in a parking garage is not professional behavior. But I'd been carrying this weight for months, this accumulation of small wrongnesses, and I needed something concrete. I caught fragments. Moved to the 9th floor. Last time was 08, so the interval. Not a question of if. He's been noticing. The new facilities coordinator. That was Diane's voice. Talking about me. There was a pause. Then Gerald's voice. Low and measured. He found the door open. Another pause. Longer. Then a voice I didn't recognize. Female. Older, with an accent I couldn't place. Said something I only partially heard. The words I caught were, hasn't started yet. When it starts, he'll know. I left. I got in my car and drove home. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed and listened to the sounds of my apartment, the refrigerator cycling, the heat clicking on and off, a dog barking somewhere outside, and everything sounded slightly different, the way familiar sounds do when you've been pulled out of the context that makes them comfortable. The next day, I went to work. I did my job. I didn't mention what I'd heard. But I started looking at the building differently. I started looking at the walls, the ceilings, the floors. I started noticing things I'd walked past 100 times. There were seams in the walls on certain floors, thin lines where the drywall had been cut and resealed. Professional work, nearly invisible, but once you saw them, you couldn't unsee them. They were on the same floors as the placards. The elevator on the east side, the one I avoided because of the vibration, had a button panel with 14 floors and 2 sublevels. Standard, but the panel had space for one more button at the bottom, a blank space, covered by a small metal plate that matched the panel's finish. I'd never looked closely enough to notice it before. The stairwell between floors 6 and 7 had a landing that was slightly larger than the others. Not by much, maybe 18 inches deeper. Enough to feel, but not enough to measure without a tape. And on that landing, at ankle height, there was a small metal ring set into the concrete floor, like a tie-down point or an anchor. None of these things meant anything on their own. A building that's 40 years old accumulates modifications, patches, additions. Walls get opened and closed. Panels get updated. Landings get poured unevenly. I told myself this repeatedly. I was reasonable about it. I am a reasonable person, but the aggregate was harder to dismiss. The tone, the placards, the locked door with no log entry, the seams, the button space, the anchor ring. The long-term employees who moved through the building with knowledge I didn't have, responding to signals I wasn't supposed to hear, following a procedure I wasn't supposed to know about. January was quiet. No tones. No incidents. I almost convinced myself I'd been building a narrative out of coincidence and paranoia. The mind does that. I know the mind does that. Then, on February 3rd, the procedure happened. I'm going to describe this carefully because my memory of that evening has a quality I don't fully trust. Not that I think I'm wrong about what happened. I believe I am accurate, but there's a texture to the memory that feels different from my other memories. Sharper in some places, blurred in others. Like a photograph that's been developed slightly wrong. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon, maybe 4:30. The sky outside was the color of dishwater. Low clouds. No wind. I was on the 8th floor, checking a thermostat that a tenant had complained about. The floor was occupied by a small insurance company, 6 employees, and at that hour, most of them were still at their desks. The tone sounded, but this time it didn't stop after 6 seconds. It continued, the same flat, sustained note, but ongoing. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The people on the 8th floor looked up. A few stood. Someone said, "Is that the fire alarm?" It wasn't, and they knew it wasn't. It sounded nothing like the fire alarm, but people reach for the explanation closest to something they understand. Then the lights changed. Not all of them. The main fluorescent stayed on. But secondary lights I'd never noticed, small LEDs embedded in the ceiling trim, so small and so flush with the surface that they were invisible when off, began to glow. A pale, steady blue. Not bright, just present. They lined the hallway in a pattern I immediately recognized. They led to the placard. The one on the 8th floor was inside the supply closet. And as I stood there watching, Priya from the 7th floor came up the stairwell. She walked past me without a word, without eye contact, went to the supply closet, opened it, and stepped inside. I looked down the hallway. The insurance company employees were standing now, confused. One of them, a young man in a blue shirt, said, "Should we evacuate?" Nobody answered him. The tone continued. I went to the stairwell. I could hear movement above and below. Footsteps, doors opening and closing. Not panicked. Measured. The long-termers were moving to their positions. I went down to the 3rd floor. The blue lights were on here too, tracing a path I could have followed with my eyes closed. Diane was already in the supply closet. I could see the light under the door. I stood in the hallway of my own floor, in the building I'd worked in for almost 2 years, and I felt something I can only describe as spatial wrongness. The hallway looked the same. The dimensions hadn't changed. But something about the way the space related to itself felt altered, as if the building had shifted on its foundation by a fraction of a degree. Not enough to see, but enough to feel in the inner ear, in the part of the brain that knows where you are without looking. The tone lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Then it stopped. The blue light stayed on for another 30 seconds, then faded. Doors opened. The long-termers emerged from their positions and went back to what they'd been doing. No announcements. No explanations. No follow-up. The insurance company employees on the 8th floor were audibly shaken. One of them called building management. Called me, technically, though the call went to the general line and was answered by someone else. They were told it was a system malfunction, a faulty PA circuit. Nothing to worry about. I went home that night and sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for almost an hour. I didn't go inside. I just sat there with the engine off, watching the windows of my building, counting the floors, looking at the shape of the structure against the gray sky. I was trying to see my own building the way I'd started seeing the Voss and Kendrick building. I was trying to determine whether every building had this, whether every structure had a procedure buried beneath its official procedures, a protocol that existed in the space between the walls and the knowledge of the people who occupied them. I didn't find anything. My apartment building was just an apartment building, but I wasn't sure that meant anything. The next morning, I went to Diane's office. I closed the door behind me. She looked up from her computer. "I saw what happened yesterday," I said. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't pretend. "I know," she said. "I've been noticing things for months. The tone, the placards, the door in sublevel 2, the people who respond." She looked at me for a long time. Her expression wasn't hostile. It wasn't friendly either. It was evaluative. She was deciding something. "How long have you been keeping notes?" she asked. "Since November." She nodded. "Gerald said you were paying attention. What is it?" I asked. "What's the procedure for?" Diane took off her glasses and set them on the desk. She rubbed the bridge of her nose. She looked tired. Not the tiredness of a long day, but the tiredness of years. The tiredness of carrying something. "I can't tell you what it's for," she said. "Not because I won't. Because I can't. I don't have the language for it. That doesn't make sense." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." She opened her desk drawer and took out a key card. White, unmarked, no lanyard. She set it on the desk between us. "Sublevel 2, she said. "The door you found open. Use this on a Wednesday, between 6 and 7 in the morning, before anyone else is in the building. Don't bring your phone. Don't bring anything electronic." "Why?" "Because if you're going to keep noticing things, you should see what we're working with. It's better if you understand. People who notice but don't understand, they don't do well." "What does that mean?" "They don't do well. It means they start sleeping badly. They start hearing the tone when it isn't playing. They start seeing the placards in other buildings." She paused. "Have you?" I didn't answer. Because the truth was, I had. 3 days earlier, I'd been in a grocery store and I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, a small beige placard with the circle and line symbol on the wall near the dairy section. When I'd gone back to look, it wasn't there. Or it was, and I couldn't find it. I wasn't sure which was worse. Diane saw my face and nodded. "Wednesday," she said. "Early." I took the keycard. I put it in my wallet. I went back to my office. That night, I dreamed about the building, not a nightmare. I want to be specific about that. It was an ordinary dream, the kind where you're going about your day and everything is slightly rearranged. In the dream, I was walking through the Voss and Kendrick building, but the hallways were longer than they should have been. Not impossibly long, just longer. And the placards on the walls were larger, and instead of the circle and line symbol, they showed something else. In the dream, I understood what the symbol meant. I felt the understanding in my chest, like a word on the tip of my tongue. But when I woke up, it was gone. And all I had was the feeling, a residue of comprehension that had no content. Wednesday came. I drove to the building at 5:45 in the morning. The parking lot was empty. The sky was still dark, but lightening at the edges, that gray blue that winter mornings have before the sun decides whether it's coming or not. I let myself in through the service entrance. The building was silent. Not the silence of a place that's empty. A building is never truly silent, not with its mechanical systems running, but the silence of a place that's waiting. I felt that. I know how it sounds. I felt it anyway. I took the stairs to sub-level 2. The fluorescents buzzed and flickered. The air smelled the same. Concrete dust. Faint chemical. My footsteps were very loud. I walked to the end of the east corridor, past the storage cages, past the archived boxes with their faded labels, to the gray fire door. I held the keycard to the reader. The LED turned green. The magnetic lock clicked. I pushed the door open. The corridor beyond was not what I expected. I'd imagined something industrial. Pipes, conduit, old boiler equipment. What I found was a hallway. Clean, well-lit, not with fluorescence, but with recessed lighting that gave off a warm, even glow. The walls were white. The floor was polished concrete, smooth and unmarked. It looked new. It looked like it had been built recently, or maintained meticulously, and this is the thought that I couldn't shake, like it existed in a different condition of time than the rest of the building. The hallway extended about 40 feet and ended at another door. This one was different. Not steel, but wood, painted white, with a small window of frosted glass at head height. Through the glass, I could see light, but no detail. I walked the hallway. My footsteps didn't echo the way they should have. The acoustics were wrong. Too dead, too absorbed, as if the walls were lined with something that swallowed sound. I reached the door. I looked through the frosted glass. I could see a room, large, open, lit by the same warm, recessed lighting. And in the room, on the floor, drawn or painted in a pattern I couldn't fully make out through the distortion of the glass, were lines. Not straight lines. Curved, intersecting, dense. Like a diagram. Like a map. Like something that had a logic I was not equipped to recognize. I put my hand on the door handle, and I stopped. I'm going to be honest about why I stopped, because I think it's the most important part of this account. I didn't stop because I was afraid. I wasn't, not in the conventional sense. I stopped because I had the sudden, absolute certainty that if I opened that door and saw what was in that room clearly, saw the pattern on the floor, understood its dimensions, processed its geometry, I would become someone who knew, and the knowing would be irreversible. I would become like Diane, like Gerald, like Carl and Priya. I would become a person who responded to the tone, who moved to a position, who carried something in them that they couldn't describe and couldn't put down. I understood, standing there, why Diane had said she couldn't explain it. Not wouldn't. Couldn't. Because the knowledge wasn't linguistic. It was structural. It would reorganize something inside me, the way learning to read reorganizes the brain. You can never see letters as just shapes again. And whatever was in that room, whatever the pattern meant, whatever the procedure was for, it would become part of how I perceived the building. Maybe all buildings. Maybe all spaces. I let go of the handle. I stepped back. I walked down the clean white corridor, through the fire door, and back into the familiar decay of sub-level 2. The door closed behind me. The LED turned red. I went upstairs. I sat in my car in the parking lot until the sun came up and people started arriving for work. I gave my 2 weeks' notice that Friday. Diane accepted it without surprise. She didn't try to talk me out of it. She didn't mention the keycard or the door or the room. She processed the paperwork with the same professional patience she brought to everything. On my last day, Gerald found me in the stairwell. He was standing on the landing between floors 4 and 5, near one of the placards. He looked like he'd been waiting for me. "You went down there," he said. "It wasn't a question. I didn't go in." He nodded. Something in his face shifted. Not quite relief, not quite disappointment. Something more complicated, probably smart, he said. Then, after a pause, most of us didn't have the choice. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I shook his hand and left. That was 14 months ago. I work for a property management company now, smaller buildings, residential mostly. Normal work. Normal routines. I don't hear the tone, but I've started noticing things. Small things. Placards I don't remember seeing before, in buildings I've managed for months. Beige, 2 by 3 inches, mounted at eye level. The symbol is different, not the circle and line, but something similar, a variation. And sometimes, late in the afternoon, when the building is quiet and the light is flat, I think I hear something, not a tone exactly. More like the memory of a tone. A space in the air where a sound should be. I've been sleeping badly, not nightmares. Just waking up at odd hours with the feeling that I've forgotten something important, something structural. Something about the geometry of the room I'm in. Last week, I was inspecting a furnace in the basement of a residential building on the east side of town. Old building, maybe 50 years. In the back of the mechanical room, behind the water heater, there was a door I hadn't noticed before. Steel, gray, with a keycard reader mounted beside it. The LED was green. I didn't open it. I turned around and went upstairs. I filed my report. I went home. But I've been thinking about what the woman said, the one I overheard in the parking garage. The voice I didn't recognize. She said it hadn't started yet. She said when it starts, he'll know. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it means to know. But I think she was right about one thing. There's a moment when noticing becomes something else. When the pattern stops being something you observe and becomes something you're inside of. I'm not there yet. I don't think I'm there yet. But the door was green, and I didn't open it, and I'm not sure that matters. Because the thing I can't stop thinking about, the thing that keeps me up at night, staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, studying the seams in the drywall, looking for lines that shouldn't be there, is something Diane said to me during that last conversation. Something I didn't mention until now because I wasn't sure it was real. My memory of that morning has that strange texture I described, sharp and blurred, overdeveloped. But I think she said it. I think it was real. She said, "You don't have to go through the door to be part of the procedure. The procedure just needs you to know it exists." I know it exists. I've known for 14 months. And the tone, the one I said I don't hear anymore. I lied about that. I hear it every day now. It's not coming from a speaker.